All right. One more lecture before spring break. Many of you are probably partly there already. It's definitely a smaller group today, huh? All right. I don't have too much to cover today, so we may even finish a little early. Well, I'm covering a lot of time. I'm not covering a lot of subject matter in this great span of time, leading to, in the end, a discussion of primates, because we'll want to situate ourselves firmly in the primates in order to look at human evolution in the final lecture. And then in the last session here in this module, it will be mostly review with a bit of spillover from the material into that final slot, but we'll review in that final time period. And if you could please send me questions of topics that you want clarified or anything at all that you want discussed in the review in the form of questions, in the form of some elaboration on the topic you want covered, not just the name of, say, don't just send me an email that says synapomorphy and send. Send me a question, send me some context that you want discussed, and I'll cover those points in the review. I will also be around over spring break if anyone wants to meet in office hours to discuss things over spring break. If you should go on a break and have a gap, have a hiatus from all this stuff. But if you're here and you want to, I can meet over spring break. So I'll finish with some points on macroevolution and then get into this discussion of the evolution of vertebrates leading to the primates. And a few of you have asked insightful questions in office hours and on email about macroevolution and how it relates to microevolution. There's an old phrase, a famous old phrase, that says macroevolution is just microevolution writ large. I don't know who said that. Somebody said that. Writ large, meaning macroevolution is just microevolution on bigger scales. There are no new processes to introduce in describing the dynamics of macroevolution. It's just those fundamental microevolutionary forces on longer and wider timescales. So you just need to sum up all of those small changes that accrue during genetic drift, that accrue during natural selection, and you'll have these big macroevolutionary patterns. That's a typical way to think of macroevolution, as nothing new, just big time scales. But there's a small but vocal and eloquent community that says, no, really we're dealing with different phenomena on some of these scales. And let me just try to describe that a little bit. It's very much a minority view. So it's not something you generally encounter, but there are people in this department that are passionate about this. There are many great thinkers who've written well on this, including Stephen Gould. Stephen Stanley wrote a book relating to this subject. The director of the Museum of Paleontology here at Berkeley speaks well on this. And one of the ways to think about this is in terms of the levels of selection discussion. When we've been talking about natural selection, we've been talking about the birth and death and reproductive output of individual organisms in populations. So selection is acting on individuals and influencing the genetics of those individuals. It's acting on phenotypes. It's the populations that evolve. It's the individuals that are undergoing selection. That's an organismal biology perspective on the process because we're focusing on the organisms at the individual level. There's some who would say, really, that's misguided, and the levels of selection of interest are at the molecular level. They're specifically genetic. Genes are the relevant level of interest in natural selection. That would be a reduction to the molecular level in our perspective on evolution. The macroevolutionists, the strict ones, say there are higher levels above the individual that are also relevant in a discussion of selection. Species themselves undergo a type of reproduction in the sense that they speciate. Single species form, quote-unquote, offspring by producing new lineages. And some of those lineages die. They go extinct. So there's an analogy there between the selection we've been describing and selection at the scale of whole clades, with the birth and death, quote-unquote, of lineages and the reproduction of species. If selection is happening on those scales, then you have a fundamentally different process. It would be species selection or species sorting. And at what scale do you say this ends? At the species level or at the scale of whole phyla of organisms? Is it a clade-based view of selection? So do you have a multiplicity of scales on which selection acts? Is selection only acting on individual phenotypes? Is it genic? Is it a strictly genetic process? That's in the nature of this bigger debate. And it relates to whether we see macroevolution as a distinct type of science or just part of microevolution. Pretty esoteric stuff, not something to concern yourself with in terms of the philosophy of all that for the exam, but for many of you it'll be fun to think about. This image was up here before on the tetrapods. Remember we looked at some of the synapomorphies that characterize familiar tetrapods, like amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. We looked at hair and amniotic eggs, the fact of having 4 limbs, tetrapod, having 4 limbs. Well, we need to complete the story, we need to talk about some of the connections in this process. The title of the lecture, I think, was Vertebrate Evolution, but we're really not talking about the origins of vertebrates, which would be way down here. I'm going to start by talking about the origin of the tetrapods, from the fish leading up to the amphibians. I'll start with that, and we'll make our way toward the mammals in this narrative, in this story of evolution. We're not meaning to imply a progression, a formal progress toward humans, the way Ernst Haeckel did with his Pedigree of Man. But we are interested in humans. We're uniquely interested in ourselves, in our health, in our well-being, in our past and our future. So it makes sense to talk about and be somewhat obsessed with ourselves, as we are, and our narrative is training that way. Are we the pinnacle of evolution and the intention of this whole process? No, not according to the scientific description of the process. But it fits our narrative well, and we'll continue that. So we'll look here at these lineages between the fish and the tetrapods. And we need to do that to look at creatures related to the lobe-finned fishes. You've heard of coelacanths that are alive today, swimming in some deep ocean waters. The coelacanth, one of these living fossils. Well, these creatures from a long, long time ago, known only as fossils, 380 million years ago, are related to the coelacanths remotely. These are creatures that some people have described as fishopods, because they form a really nice missing link between the typical fish and the typical amphibian. One thing that these creatures have, and this is tiktaalik. It became quite famous a couple of years ago. It was found in the Arctic region, subarctic, Arctic, northern Canada, Ellesmere Island, I believe, by a couple of American workers. And it became very well known because it was a spectacular discovery in many ways. But it fit a gap in our understanding nicely. One of the aspects of this creature is that it has limbs instead of fins, or something in between fins and limbs. In these appendages here are the vestiges of the same bones that we have, the homologs of an upper arm bone and a lower arm bone and a wrist and an ankle. So they have homologous elements to the later tetrapods. They were aquatic, but they seem to have been walking on these appendages on the surface on the substrate of the water in which they lived. So they used them for locomotion. They walked on them. And they supported themselves, their eyes up here tending to be on the top of the head, to be upwardly directed, these bottom dwellers. They were capable of swimming, probably with a paddle-like tail like that. And they're in the shallows of the waterways. So they fit the habitat expectation we would have for a transitional organism moving on to land, in a sense. And there are other creatures from this category, Ichthyostega, Acanthostega. Some of them have more than 5 rays in the hands and feet, but pretty quickly in this evolutionary process, you're reduced to 5 rays, like you have. That's fairly conservative, starting early on, that this phenomenon of having only 5 is set and conserved. And everything we see among the tetrapods has either 5 of these elements or a reduction from there. If you think of the horse, it's reduced those 5 all the way down to 1, with a couple of little vestiges of the others remaining. But we still have the good 5 basal type that gets set in place soon after these organisms exist. All that's happening deep in the Paleozoic, those transitions. We already looked at this Permian time and what was happening on the Permian landscape, and we saw at least one image of a guy like this. I'll come back to that slide in a second. But remember those finned creatures we saw in that dramatic depiction of the end Permian extinctions? Creatures like this that had these big sails and these big lumbering beasts, they existed here at the end of the Permian on Pangaea, remember? And their fossils can be found on the various continents, represented by Pangaea, for example, in Africa and Antarctica that were formerly connected because they were roaming that landscape. They dominated that landscape of the Permian, these ancient creatures. And I referenced the fact that they're often confused with dinosaurs and that they're not. No, they're members of the radiation to which we belong, the synapsids, the synapsid line, as opposed to the reptilian line. They're often referred to as mammal-like reptiles, but they're not reptiles. They are mammal-like. They're members of the big clade to which we belong and that will result in us later, we know in hindsight. They're interesting in their own regard, this sail. What were they doing with this big thing on their back? Were they sailing? There's a couple of papers that said they might have been sailing, getting into the water and sailing with it. Probably not. We're only limited by our imaginations in explaining what this thing was used for. We need concrete hypotheses that we can investigate and test. We're not just free to use our imaginations and tell stories in science. We can do that, but it's not necessarily scientific. It needs to be testable. The sailing hypothesis, I'm not sure how it's been tested, if it has. What else might this thing have been used for these creatures that were so abundant in the end Permian, the dominant terrestrial vertebrates? Creatures like this? Yeah. Heat regulation. An excellent possibility. How might that have been? How might that have worked? You get cold? Okay, so in warming up. Yeah, so you could open this up in the morning and position yourself in relation to the sun and bag rays and warm up if you're a cold-blooded creature, as we expect these ancestral types to be dependent on the environmental temperatures in regulating their own body temperatures. Yeah, that's a possibility that they could have used it behaviorally to position themselves to warm up, maybe even to cool down, right? On a hot day, you might have been able to have evaporative cooling on a surface like that to allow yourself to cool down. So to regulate temperature, which will be a hallmark of synapsid evolution, the ability to regulate body temperature. In this case, it's through behavioral means. It's a type of homeothermy. But what we'll see later is the ability to regulate temperature through metabolic means, physiological means like shivering, the ability of mammals to shiver, to quiver the muscles and warm the body that way, and other mechanisms to internally regulate temperature. Do you have a question? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Excellent. Another possibility might involve sexual selection for the existence of this fin. And indeed, there's been modeling work that's done, lots of work has been done on this creature over the decades. And modeling work, some of it suggests, no, this wouldn't be effective as a temperature regulation device, and that it's more likely to be a sexual selection phenomenon. And there is some evidence of sexual dimorphism in some of these groups, where the males look more elaborate, or some individuals look more elaborate, have larger fins than other individuals. And the supposition is that maybe it's the males with them, with the big sails, and the females without. So sexually selected, and then you might even imagine they become colorful and patterned, and not just the size of it. Anything else you might want to suggest as a possibility for this, the selection of a creature like this, a phenotype like this? Mm-hmm. Sure. I don't think there's any preserved remains that show skin between the spines. I believe there's some evidence along the bones themselves to suggest that there was good blood flow, though, in the form of these canals that suggest innervation and blood flow. So that would imply a soft tissue cover, if that were the case. And that would suggest maybe this thermoregulatory role. If you're able to shunt blood and regulate blood flow, you would shunt it there when you wanted to warm the body, because then it would come back to the heart warm, and vice versa when you're cooling the body. But no soft tissue remains exactly show the existence of that. Yes? Could it make it look bigger than it actually was? Sure. Make you look big and scary, and maybe for predator avoidance, for example. Yeah, similar to that. As a deterrent to predators. Lots of animals fluff themselves up, make themselves look big, or actually are big and difficult to eat as a result. So yeah, see how your imagination can go, ideas can run, and then the strategy in the scientific process for these ancient creatures is to narrow it down to testable alternatives and not just to continue to tell stories. That's the accusation against so much of paleontology. It's just so storytelling. You're just like Rudyard Kipling telling stories of how these magnificent creatures got their parts. If you've read Rudyard Kipling's stories, he actually had a book of stories called Just So Stories. Just So Stories. And so if you are accused of just so storytelling, that's what you're doing. You're explaining how the elephant got its trunk by having been caught by a crocodile, and that crocodile pulled that trunk, and you can tell a wonderful story. But it's not testable, and even though logical, not testable, and probably not true. Anything else? Yeah, in the back. If time permits, can I explain why the synapsids are not reptiles? In effect, well, it's synapomorphy-based. In a cladistic context, it would be a simple case of a divergence event with the synapsids on a line here, and your reptiles, including the birds, on a line here. So there are synapomorphies that diagnose the two taxa distinctly. And for the synapsids, the synapomorphies are in the skull, they're in the ankles, they're in the postcranium, they're throughout the body. So really well-established divergence. And then the notion is that there was no connection after that, no hybridization. So the reptiles are up here, having gone their way. This is the synapsid line that will include the mammals, ultimately. So the ones we're talking about now are these extinct lineages that you can refer to as non-mammalian synapsids. This is a non-mammalian synapsid. It's a synapsid, but not a mammal. And none of them are reptiles, because the reptiles are doing their own thing. Great. Jumping all the way to the Mesozoic. So those things go extinct. So much of that Permian terrestrial fauna goes extinct. There are some lineages that carry through into the Triassic and continue to survive, but there's a big shift there in those terrestrial communities. And we enter the age of dinosaurs, so-called, in the Mesozoic. And that's what gets all the attention, right? That's every 4-year-old knows his or her dinosaurs, it seems, better than I do. They don't interest me that much, frankly. These things are much more curious, these synapsids. But they're traditionally thought to have been underfoot of the dinosaurs that were doing all the interesting stuff. And the synapsids were just these little shrew-like creatures in the bushes, skulking along, not doing much until that explosion of synapsids you would see in the Cenozoic after the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs. Over the last 10 years, the story has been rewritten to a great degree through the discovery, 10 years, amazing, and through a bunch of discoveries in the Mesozoic of synapsids that had a diversity of form and a diversity of behavior as interpreted by their form. Creature like this, Castora cauda, many of these fossils are coming from well-preserved sediments in China. In the Middle Jurassic, 164 million years ago, this slab comes out of a farmer's field, and the farmer recognizes it as unique, saves a bunch of the parts, shows it to someone who shows it to someone, and can you see what's there? It's a whole skeleton. There's the head. There are the hands. There's a foot. There's the vertebral column. There's the pelvis. These impressions here, this dark shadow, that's hair. Almost certainly. It's an interpretation of that fossil, but it's a really good interpretation. It's strong evidence when you get into the details of seeing the fibers in there that represent the hair itself. And hair is this quintessential synapomorphy along the synapsid line for the mammal ancestors, right? Nothing has hair in the animal universe except these mammals and their mammal ancestors. So this is something clearly on that line, not just by virtue of the hair, but the details of the ankles and the dentition, aspects of the skull. Everything shows that it's well on that line. Now, the tail is flattened. The vertebrae, the caudal vertebrae, are flat, relatively flat. The hind feet are huge. The teeth up here in the front of the mouth are sharp and recurved. They're kind of curved backwards. And so the interpretation by these authors is that this Castora cauda creature was a swimmer like this, with a paddle-like tail, because we know that creatures today, like beavers, have dorso-ventrally flattened caudal vertebrae and big hind feet for kick swimming with. But they interpret this beaver-like thing as having teeth that were built for catching fish, sharp, recurved teeth. So those are hypotheses, those are stories based on the morphology that are based in evidence of comparative anatomy from living animals today. So you're on safer ground and more testable ground when you have analogs from today that you can compare these creatures with. So they name it Castora cauda lutra similis, beaver tail otter-like thing. And off it goes in the Mesozoic, swimming in the water, relatively good-sized, maybe this big, and eating fish. That's way different even here than what we expected these mammal ancestors to be doing with the dinosaurs. That's more diversity itself. I'll give you one more example because there are several that we could look at. Question, though?
How would they know
That it's diurnal? I don't remember specifically, but probably related to the structure of the optic nerve in the eye. That would usually be a basis for determining whether it had day vision or night vision. Yeah. And most of these mammals in the Mesozoic, these mammal ancestors were thought to have been nocturnal. Yeah. Good question. Diurnal meaning awake during the day, right, as opposed to nocturnal. So here's another one. Complete skeleton of this thing. And this is like the size of a big house cat or something like that. And that's really big compared to what was available before. So this is stretching the size limits of what we understood before. A big creature from the Mesozoic with stomach contents preserved. There's actually bones in the belly of this thing representing its last meal. And guess what's in the belly? This thing has big honking teeth, big, heavy, predatory teeth in the mouth. In the belly is a little baby dinosaur, a little psittacosaur. So you have to coin a new word for this type of behavior. It's a dinosaurivore. The thing ate dinosaurs. And that flips the script nicely for those of us who love these creatures and get bored with the dinosaurs. Nice, it's eating the dinosaurs. Excellent. And that's very clear from the stomach contents, if the identification is correct of this being a baby psittacosaur. And here's a dramatization of the process. These things looking like wolverines or something, tearing poor little psittacosaur limb from limb while mommy looks on. Archaeopteryx from the branch above, appalled at the scene. Yeah, good stuff. We do need more artists in this line of work, too. A lot of these, that's a good one, but a lot of the illustrations are just terrible that reconstruct these things. So if you have any affinity for that, please. So some of the details that are happening in the evolution of mammals are complex but interesting. And I'll highlight a couple. Some of them relate to the teeth. You're getting a dentition from a more basic type where the teeth are all relatively similar to a type where the teeth are functionally differentiated. Incisors in the front, stabbing canines in the back, a molar row for grinding behind that. That differentiation is happening. And occlusion, proper occlusion of the uppers and lowers so that they form an integrated set is happening, as opposed to, so you're getting chewing, you're getting proper chewing for the first time. Why might that be important in this in this process? What's the big deal about being able to chew your food well? Yeah. It aids in digestion, absolutely. It aids in digestion. If you're able to reduce your food in your mouth and then even mix it with saliva that's full of enzymes and starting that digestion process in the mouth, but reducing the food and increasing surface area before it enters the gut, it aids in digestion. It aids in the efficient extraction of the nutriment in your food. And if you're a high metabolism type creature that runs hot, you need to obtain a lot of energy, high quality energy, quickly during the course of your life. And so this is related to the warm-blooded, the evolution of the changes in metabolism that are occurring. And it's related to changes at the back of the jaw, where there's a move from having multiple bones in the lower jaw, as this basal synapse had, multiple bones in the lower jaw, to a lower jaw that's only a single bone, a single strong bone that's effective for powerful chewing. It's more interesting than that, though, because the bones at the back of the jaw don't just disappear. They migrate, and there's an exquisite series of fossils that show this. It's one of the great examples of missing links. Darwin would be thrilled if he had known the details of how much we know about this transition. These bones from the back of the lower jaw migrate up into the inner ear. So your articular and your quadrate, detail's not important, if just in case you want to go into these types of fields in medicine or something. Ear, nose, throat doctors, listen up. You'll be the coolest kid in school if you know some of this before you get to med school. The articular and the quadrate, which used to form the joint, now migrate off and evolve into different bones. The articular and the quadrate migrate into bones of the inner ear, and those former jaw joint bones become your incus malleus and stapes in the inner ear. In this ancient configuration, they were actually involved in hearing. And there's some frogs that do this, put their heads on the ground and pick up the vibrations from the environment and hear that way, because the vibrations are going through their lower jaw. Now these bones are still serving a hearing function, but housed in the inner ear in a specialized capsule for really fine hearing. So you're getting a trend toward effective chewing, effective hearing, diversity of ecology, increasing body size, all these trends happening in the Mesozoic during the time of the dinosaurs. Yes, in the back. Okay. Yeah, Pachycetus. We looked at the evolution of cetaceans in here a couple lectures ago, right? Pachycetus is that basal-most cetacean, and it's using, apparently, the bones at the back of its jaw as part of its hearing. And you'll see trends, I presume, in cetacean evolution away from that. There are some corollaries just in other clades within the mammals about similar trends. And you can tell me more after lecture, please. Thank you. So on a cladogram like this, here's a modern mammal showing the bones of the inner ear fully separated off the jaw. And so now you have a dentary squamosal jaw joint. If you have TMJ problems, your temporomandibular joint is just those two bones that are a synapomorphy for modern mammals, having those two bones in articulation. Again, detail's not important, just the broad trends. If you look at the development of a mammal, like an opossum like this, and you look at it from the fetal condition, day one here, all the way through adulthood, guess what you see when you look at the embryology? You see that complex of bones at the back of the jaw in the baby marsupial here. As it grows, day 7, day 15, day 21, the bones are actually migrating off the lower jaw and into their final position as hearing in the hearing apparatus. So the ontogeny, the development of this mammal, is reflecting its phylogeny that we see in the fossil record. And that's a phenomenon that evolutionary biologists called ontogeny recapitulating the phylogeny. The ontogeny, the development of the individual animal, is a recap of the evolutionary history of the creature. And this is part of the study of the field Evo-Devo. If this interests you, it's a very integrative field because you can do embryology, genetic-based work, and fossil work combined in one package. It's a great integrative discipline. If that interests you, explore it. It's fantastic stuff. How about this phenomenon in mammalian evolution? Suckling from the mother, suckling milk from the mother. That's altogether different. Getting high-quality, easy-to-digest food directly from another individual of your species, and specifically your parent, your mom. So mammary glands that produce milk are a synapomorphy of the mammals, the mammaliforms. The name is related to that. So the production of milk and either just dripping from these mammary glands as platypuses experience. Platypus mom essentially oozes the milk out of the mammary glands, doesn't have nipples. Or in the form of the marsupials and the placentals where there's a nipple and the young latches onto it. In the case of the marsupials, the young climbs into the pouch, gets onto the nipple, and in some of these marsupials, the nipple swells up in the mouth of that little joey, or whatever you would call it. It swells up in its mouth, and the little baby can't even get off if it wanted to. It's buttoned on there because the nipple's swelled in its mouth, and it can't get off until it grows enough that its mouth's big enough that it can let go. Very effective to latch your baby on like that and deliver it this great food. Eh? It's a strange system, but it leads to a bond between one individual and another that's also unique. And because this bond can carry through the months and even years, there's an opportunity for complex information exchange between these organisms. And that may set the basis for a lot of the complexity in mammals, in their cognitive abilities to learn from other individuals. I had a video that I wanted to show, but I'll have to save it for now. Oh, what the heck, I have time.
They reproduce.
Here it is. It's too good.
Instead of laying eggs, they produce young without protective shells, and this grey kangaroo is about to do so.
It shows exactly the process I was just talking about.
Out comes not a shelled egg, but a tiny, underdeveloped little worm. It weighs less than a lump of sugar. It has no back legs, but it has forelegs, and they are just strong enough to pull it through its mother's fur. It started on an extraordinary journey. To survive, it must get to a pouch higher up on its mother's belly. Instinctively, this tiny living particle climbs upwards against the pull of gravity and towards the smell of the pouch. After about 3 minutes, it reaches the lip of the pouch and clambers down to safety inside. There, it clamps its tiny mouth on its mother's nipple and takes its first meal of milk. As it grows, the ingredients of the milk coming from the nipple change to ensure that the infant gets exactly the nutrients it needs for each stage of its development. By the time it's 9 months old, it's getting a bit cramped. It's time to enter the outside world. It's almost like a second birth. He's a little unsteady at first, but Mum offers a helping hand. Now he's known as a Joey. It's all a bit much for one day, and he heads back to the safety and security of Mother's pouch. It will be another year before he's fully independent.
Another year? Come on, kid. You know, it's so one of the neat things about marsupials in relation to placentals, marsupials with a marsupium, with a pouch, the gestation in the womb is really short in time. So when the baby emerges, it's just that tiny little grub. And then the continued development occurs in the marsupium for a long time in association with mom. But, fully a year of development there. The placentals have flipped that. The placentals spend a long time in the womb developing inside the body of mom. And then after birth, a shorter period of dependency on the mom. Although it can still be quite long. It can still be years in the case of some primates and elephants. But that period, that dependency on the mother is such an interesting and unlikely aspect of the evolutionary process. I mean, how unlikely are those kangaroos in just every facet of their lives? If you rewound the script of evolution, if you rewound it back to, let's say, back to the stromatolites, and you allowed the process to run again, would you end up with these kangaroos acting like that? That's an interesting question to ask. Biologists tend to think no. It's not a deterministic process. And if allowed to run again, this pattern of evolution could end up with very different phenomena. It's not deterministically going to result in kangaroos in Australia and placental primates like ourselves. You might have a very different outcome. So we're in the Cenozoic now with this radiation of placental mammals, types like ourselves, and we need to get into the primates. It's debated as to whether the primates evolved right after the KT boundary, the KPG boundary, or that they have some ancestry back in the Mesozoic, the primate lineage. The fossil evidence contradicts, in some cases, the molecular evidence, as we discussed earlier. Just to introduce the primates, that will be a focus of next time when we talk about the hominids. Remember that it's a good monophyletic group, this group of placental mammals now. It includes the lemurs and lorises, the lemurs of Madagascar and the lorises also, the tarsiers, and you've been introduced to these guys in lab, right? You studied the phylogeny of some of these creatures with some focus on the tarsiers and its position in the phylogeny. The New World monkeys and Old World monkeys being this paraphyletic group within the primates, and then the lesser apes or gibbons, right? You've learned a few things about these guys, including that these long-armed gibbons that swing from the trees, you can see it in their skeletons. And then the hominids, the great apes, including, who's this? Orangutan, yes. Orange man, orangutan. Who's that? Gorilla. And there's 2 flavors of each of these things at least. There's maybe 2 species of orangutan, 2 species of gorilla, maybe 3, but a couple of varieties. Chimpanzee. And who's that? Anyone recognize that creature? Huh? Bonobo, yes. So not a chimp, but very closely related to the chimp is the bonobo. Like there being a couple of gorillas, a couple of orangutans. Essentially, these are a couple different related kinds of creature, but very different in some aspects of their biology. It's called a bonobo, very interesting creature from Central Africa. Yeah, from Africa, these guys. From Africa, this guy. The basal lineage, the orangutan, Asian. And that geography will come into this story when we look at the hominids. My daughter to represent in an excellent football posture there, right? Representing our clade. So what we need to do is look at the transition in here from the great apes to the humans via the Australopithecines and friends. And we'll do that next time. Have a wonderful spring break.